Ecologues is part of a larger project called The Writings on the Wall, sponsored by Erasmus+, which is a partnership with News Decoder and the Climate Academy in Brussels. And the American Library is our gracious host for the Ecologues aspect of that project. And so, as Alice mentioned, I'm Maria Krasinski. I'm the managing director of News Decoder, and we are an educational news nonprofit based here in Paris. And we work with schools all around the world, doing journalism training programs that really help young people examine the big global issues through the tools and techniques of journalism, getting out there, breaking out of their bubbles to get out and talk to people, talk to experts, learn about what's really happening in these issues, and really take a solutions-based approach to journalism and to unpacking the large issues that we're all facing and become better global citizens in the process. And the Writings on the Wall and Ecologues is our kind of public forum to bring together expert voices and voices from the general public and for youth who are interested in these huge intractable topics that we don't even know where to begin with. Even in our planning call for this, we're like, energy, where do we begin? There's so much to talk about. And that's why we convene these events. Our larger goal really is to help build resources for climate education. And how do we teach about climate in schools and outside of schools? Educators take a lot of forms. And so we're really delighted to have this series ongoing on these big topics. As Alice mentioned, we started off the first talk, which was what is the climate crisis, just to frame some of these issues. Last month, we focused on environmental justice. And tonight, we're tackling the still enormous topic of energy. And we have 4 speakers with us, 2 here in the room at the American Library and 2 up here on Zoom. And so we have with us Emi Bertoli from the International Energy Agency and Golnoosh Mir, from Innovation Project Manager with Enertime and the France country representative for Yes Europe. Up on Zoom, we have joining us Tom Burke, who is the co-founder and chairman of the climate change think tank E3G, Third Generation Environmentalism. And we have Andreas Rüdinger, who coordinates energy transition for France with IDRI, a think tank here in Paris. So as you said, we had a conversation among our speakers tonight to discuss the themes, where we're going to start with this huge topic, and really what it comes down to, energy is at the heart of the climate challenge, why we are holding these series, why we're doing this project. And it's also key to the solution. We've talked thus far in this series and in general about the need to cut emissions, cut X% of emissions in countries around the world. And the primary driver of those greenhouse gas emissions is energy, energy accounting for nearly 3/4 of greenhouse gas emissions. And so we're going to break into policy. We're going to look at technology innovation. We're going to look at politics tonight to see what we can do about this. So we're going to start off with Andreas, who's looming up here above us, to just frame the issue. Where do we stand now? What does this energy transition look like? Where do we stand in the energy crisis? So Andreas, currently, as we said, you're working with IDRI here in Paris. And as we've said, even you were struggling also to know where to start with tonight's discussion. Even IDRI is doing quite a lot of work. And so I wonder if you can just sort of help us set the stage with where we are in the crisis and how that's impacting the energy transition here in France and beyond.
Thank you so much. Well, hello to everyone. I'm really sorry to not being able to be with you physically in Paris today due to other obligations. Well, as you mentioned, the energy question is really complex and a lot of ground to cover. So I'll just do a small focus on the current energy crisis, trying to describe a few things and how this interacts with the energy transition, which is not so easy and obvious. Just to remind everyone that what we call the current energy crisis did not start with the war in Ukraine, but it started before, actually due to the tensions between supply and demand for natural gas due to the strong economic recovery after COVID. So this was the first basically driver for price increase. Of course, all of this then was exacerbated with the tensions due to the war in Ukraine. with, of course, Russia representing 40% of total gas imports in Europe so far. So this was a huge blow and huge pressure for European security of supply. And of course, the main impact we have seen in Europe due to the energy crisis was the rapid surge in prices, especially wholesale market prices. For natural gas, they went as high as 250 euros per megawatt hour in August 22. This is about 10 times the historic average on wholesale market prices. We had the same for electricity, with prices reaching 600 euros per megawatt hour in France on average in August and September. So like a huge change in what energy costs, but obviously there's much more happening. We also saw that there's huge geopolitical impacts due to our dependency on fossil fuels and on energy imports. We're still financing the Russian war effort, basically. We just have to consider that the European natural gas import bill tripled last year to reach up to 400 billion euros. So this is kind of really huge economic and also social impacts as well. And yeah, so a big crisis, a lot of economic and social impacts. And obviously, our first reaction was to say, okay, this crisis basically, what it does is mainly that it shows quite painfully the consequences of our very long-lasting dependency on fossil fuels in Europe and also elsewhere in the world. And this would mean, obviously, that the crisis should be a very strong accelerator for the energy transition and for everything going with climate policies and energy policies, etc. But unfortunately, it's not that simple. And what we have observed in most of the countries is that the initial reaction, the initial policy reaction, mostly focused on crisis relief, meaning addressing the economic and social urgencies related to the very quick surge in prices, without necessarily increasing or accelerating the transition in parallel. Just to give you a small illustration, or quite an impressive one actually, the International Energy Agency stated recently that public subsidies for fossil fuels, for natural gas, petrol products, and coal, basically, have doubled worldwide in 2022, reaching more than $1 trillion. So that's the big elephant in the room. We could talk about investing in the transition as long as we want. We could talk about carbon pricing, but here it is. We're still worldwide, we're spending $1,000 billion on subsidies for fossil fuels. And the same has actually happened in France, where reacting to the crisis, the French state, the French government decided in late 2021 to block tariffs for natural gas and electricity for households and small consumers, and provide additional relief to pay bills. So these represented a total expenditure of about 30 billion euros in 2022, up to 45 billion in 2023. So that's huge amounts of money. And the actual issue was that compared to this, we did not get one additional euro to invest in the energy transition. We had actually no real reinforcement of support policies, of subsidies going into energy efficiency in buildings, into electric vehicles, into deployment of renewable energies. So that's kind of the problem that we have currently, that the crisis actually shows us how important this energy transition actually is to become more resilient to future crises. But when facing the crisis, it's not the easiest moment to actually react and accelerate, because we're not having the money currently. And this is basically the case for all of the actors, for households, for companies. They all have to face higher bills. So they have quite a hard time to engage additional investments. And just to give you an illustration on how important the energy transition would actually be to face this crisis, I had calculated last year that if France had achieved the targets for energy efficiency in buildings that it had defined in 2008 with the Grenelle Summit for 2020, it would actually no longer have been dependent on Russian gas since 2020. So if we just had achieved our targets on building renovations, we wouldn't have had such a crisis in France, for example. So that's, of course, a huge priority, consuming less energy, consuming cleaner energy, and basically just getting rid of fossil fuels as fast as we can.
Excellent. Thank you so much for, you posed a lot of questions here and given us a lot of figures to think about that I think we'll come back to in this conversation. But to continue introducing our speakers with some introductory remarks, and kind of come to a specific example of some of these technological innovations taking place to advance this energy transition. We have Golnoosh Mir, as we mentioned, who is an engineer by training, but now working with Enertime, an innovation firm in France, focusing on industrial energy efficiency and decarbonization. So Golnoosh, can you tell us a little bit more about the work you're doing, maybe linking to some of the issues that Andreas just laid out and how your work contributes to that?
So thank you for your really interesting introduction, Andreas. And I would like to highlight that Enertime, what we would do is to we actually increase the energy efficiency of the industry. And what that actually means is that we try to design the technologies tailor-made for the heat-intensive industries that would help them to decarbonize these hard-to-abate sectors in the industry. To give you some examples, there are two products that we are working on. First of all, it's the organic Rankine cycles, which are basically a thermodynamic cycle that are capturing the waste heat from the industrial processes, namely as steel, glass, cement, which are producing enormous amount of waste heat. And by capturing this, we are using the Rankine cycle to generate electricity after the turbine is turned. So basically, the company that I'm working in, we are designing these turbines and compressors. We are doing the tailor-made design, and we would try to address the maximum size that is adaptable to these processes. So by ORCs, we are helping the industries to use the self-consumption of electricities and to actually benefit and valorize the waste heat that is already existing in the processes, and to be able to use this electricity for the internal use of these factories, these plants. And the other products are the high temperature heat pumps. And by high temperature, I would say above 100 degrees. And these heat pumps are actually using the waste heat in the lower temperature processes in the industry, and they're using the thermodynamical cycles. And by this, they are elevating the temperature, and we are able to use this, let's say, waste heat in a valorized way. So basically, we are trying to address the waste heat that we have already available in different industries and try to use them in the form of heat and electricity for the internal use of the process itself. So maybe I went through the engineering details a bit, and I know we are coming from different backgrounds here. So what does this mean? So I would say innovation would require enormous work. It would require researchers, it would require the industries, corporates, investors, policymakers. It would require the social acceptance for such innovations to be actually implemented and actually work. So what I was just explaining to you is something that we are explaining to each of the industrial plants that we are trying to get them motivated to implement this technology in their process. And explaining this is not an easy task, because you need to make them understand. For them, it's the necessity to decarbonize their industry, to actually think about their industries are working quite well, and we are having all this, let's say, penalties over the carbon prices. There are skyrocketing electricity prices. So by this, they are feeling the need that's, okay, maybe the way I'm doing my business, maybe the way I'm producing my, let's say, material are not good for this environment, for this earth. And I would say once we would start to realize what we are doing as harm to the plant, then we would feel the need to actually accept such innovations and to take the risk for this. So just to give you an introduction of how this research and engineering would come into action. So first of all, the researchers would start with a prototype of one of these technologies, and it would be like a small scale in the lab. Then that would be turned into a demonstrator scale, which is going to be an industry accepting the, let's say, first of its kind state-of-art technology to be in their process. And by this, we are testing how this technology would be effective. After testing and, let's say, having these volunteers, we would be able to say if it is going to be adaptable for different processes. And then at the final stage, we can say, okay, so this technology is mature enough and we can recognize it as a, let's say, technology that is certain to decarbonize, to let our energy systems to be carbon neutral. I would not say carbon zero. I would say carbon neutral. So just to give you an overview of this research and innovation is not an easy task, and it would need efforts from different players to make that actually to, let's say, replace what is in our comfort zone, what is already working in the industries, and they would see the need to replace them with the new technologies. So I would say I have been thinking about how the youth and how the young people can, let's say, motivate themselves to be a part of this. We would be all thinking, okay, so these are going to be just pure research. What would a young person has to do with it? I would say each and every initiative, each and every small project that we take the effort to work on it, it's going to be like the background of what we can actually implement in the future. For instance, being a part of a community, being a part of something bigger than us can help to, let's say, create this concern, create this question in our heads that's, okay, as an individual, how can I help this to roll out? How can I make this happen? To just give you an example, I'm a part of, let's say, youth-run community. The name is Yes Europe. So we are now based in 20 European countries. We are the young professionals, we are the students, which we have the background in sustainability and energy. And let's say, we are just one of the examples of these nonprofit organizations that we are helping this, let's say, climate change to move in the right direction, to actually be addressed and tackled. So what we would do is that we would just create the platform for the young people to be a part of a community, to take initiatives, to do projects, to share the knowledge, to get themselves updated with the information that they would need. We don't require to have sophisticated knowledge in order to do something. It's just going to be each of us having a talent, having a skill that we can put it into work, into something useful. And any of us can start such communities and can start such project, organization. And it's just about if we are motivated, if we actually want to do this or not. So that was all on my side.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Before we move on to our next speaker, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question kind of about Enertime. You said something about, making them see the need to replace the current structures with new technologies, which kind of goes back a bit to what Andreas was saying, with the energy crisis now is not necessarily accelerated the transition. People are hurting, prices are up, companies as well. So in your experience with your company, what is the market uptake on this kind of technology and these innovations that you're helping to produce?
So I would say it's not an easy task. Because first of all, it would require the right means of financing, because such technologies are not something that the end user would accept the risk to pay for them. So you would need to create the right business models, the right subsidies from the government. So step by step, you are going to make it acceptable for them. And the concern is mainly the financial part. Who is going to finance my project? Okay, if I would see that I am taking the risk to put this, let's say, not so mature technology as a demonstrator in my, let's say, process, which is already working fine, then what is the benefit for me? So first of all, you need to motivate them that, okay, the finance is going to come from these resources, and then by this, you're going to save up, let's say, an X amount of euros per year. You're going to save in your fuel consumption, you're going to save in your electricity bills, etc. So you would need to show them a complete business model of how they can pay for this, how they can have the return on investment in the coming years. And I would say doing this is not easy at all.
That's sort of the theme for all of these. It's not easy at all. And I guess with that frame of mind, we'll come to the policy side of things, which can also be a challenge, but we're going to learn more about some of the policies taking effect with Emi Bertoli. And so the International Energy Agency, as I'm sure we're all aware, is working with countries around the world to shape energy policy. You know, essentially, you're the world's energy advisor, being founded, after the energy crisis of the 1970s. And yeah, we have a couple of slides here to kind of illustrate some of the projects you're working on, namely the digitalization of power. And so, yeah, can you walk us through what that looks like, what that means, and its potential impact for decarbonization?
Thank you very much, and thank you for actually the other introduction that give me a bit of ground on let's say how important the work that we're doing is as well. So for those of you who don't know the International Energy Agency, so we're saying we actually work with governments on policies, but we also collect data, we make evidence, we give recommendations, we create peer-to-peer let's say opportunities for policymakers to exchange experiences and learn from each other. And especially in topics like the energy transition, like digitalization, there's not so much going on out there. Like countries haven't found the perfect solution to move forward as fast as they should to reach climate objectives. So it's really key to give them, those case studies, those evidence, those contacts to actually find a solution to advance together. As Andreas mentioned earlier, and you mentioned earlier, of course, the key of the problem, like in the climate crisis and emergency, is of course energy, because energy is producing a lot of greenhouse gas emission, and within the energy sector, almost half of it is actually related to the production of electricity. So of course, investing more in renewables, getting that side of the system greener is really key. But as we can see here, and here the role of Golnoosh as well, a huge part of it in terms of emissions comes from industry. And sometimes this is really hard, let's say, to abate, because technologies are new, they're costly, and of course, everything goes, all the decisions goes around business and the return on investment. And at the same time, transport is also one of the key areas. And if we move on to the next slide, we see some of the challenges that and the massive changes that are required actually to move forward towards we call it net zero emission scenario. And mentioning part of the work that we're doing is actually to create scenarios and to create visions for what the future might look like, so that policymakers can actually project themselves and understand or get a vision of where this should be going and make the necessary, let's say, adjustment to get in that direction. So in our scenarios and studies, for example, we see that between now and 2030, which is basically tomorrow, capacity addition should grow fourfold in terms of solar PV and wind. There should be a 80 times increase in the sales of electric cars. And at the same time, we should also reduce, let's say, our energy intensity, so increasing massively energy efficiency. And of course, like these huge changes that are happening and will happen in the system, they impact heavily like the electricity system. So if we move in the next slide, just to give you an idea of how all these elements play together. So if we look at, let's say, a standard day, as we'll move forward with more renewable generation, we can see that there is a peak of, let's say, production in the middle of the day, which is usually not when the electricity is used. Because if we look at the home consumption curve, there is usually a peak in the morning and a huge peak in the evening. So of course, moving forward, both the production and the consumption would become more and more weather dependent. So there is a need to actually shift this peak or reduce this peak and actually match the production and the consumption. And of course, this will become more and more complex if we think about more rooftop PVs coming on board and an electrification of consumption, for example, more electric car, more electric heating, more air conditioners, more electric cooking. So all of this will impact heavily on this and increment like this consumption curve. And if nothing is done, we would either have to turn on some very polluting gas plants, for example, to cover for that consumption that it's not managed by, let's say, to be covered by generation, invest heavily on batteries, but then again, like must be seen whether there is a feasibility which is economical and technical. So like this to give you an overview, let's say, of the complexity of it. And of course, to manage it like in a better way and more efficiently, that's where digitalization comes into play. So if we move on to the next slide, basically what we mean by digitalization, we basically mean data gathering, analysis, and taking action based on this. So like to give you some of the example of this application in the energy sector in terms of renewables, for example, one complex thing is that it's not enough to actually install more and more renewables. It is key to be able to integrate them intelligently and effectively in the system, and that's where digitalization is needed. In terms of rooftop PV, we've seen countries where the operators who manage the grid, they don't know where this rooftop is. They don't know how to manage it. And as numbers are growing, this might become an issue rather than a solution. And of course, like the more we move forward in terms of also like climate change, extreme weather events, the more it becomes key also like to be able to forecast more precisely and in an advanced way, like what is expected, let's say, moving forward. And at the same time, as I was saying, transport will change a lot. We'll have huge masses of electric vehicles coming on board, which means that they will have to be charged. And this, of course, has to be managed smartly because the risk is that people will all charge at the same time and the system won't be able to, let's say, to supply the necessary electricity to cover for that. And at the same time, of course, digitalization can offer the opportunity for more innovative business models, for new ways of doing things in terms of public transport, in terms of peer-to-peer trading, in terms of managing energy and having more interactive devices that can provide, let's say, the shift that is needed, like to support more, let's say, decarbonized energy systems. And if we move towards the next slide, so this is my last one, just to give you a bit of an overview of what we're talking about. So of course, like the final goal of all of this and digitalization and transition is to have environmental and climate benefits to really like counteract this climate crisis that we're facing. And of course, an important message is that technologies is not to be implemented because it's fancy, because it's cool, but it has to serve a specific aim. So in this case, as I was mentioning before, digitalization could actually help to have a faster and better integration of renewables, but also like to enhance energy efficiency. As we saw in the graph earlier, so it's not enough, let's say, to reduce energy, the energy we consume, but it is key to reduce it when and where it is needed. And at the same time, digitalization can also help to improve the efficiency of the system. That means that we can optimize where we invest we can leverage innovative business model, as I was saying, and we can actually make a more efficient use of the existing infrastructure. Because of course, like the cheapest way to do things is either to consume less or to use better what we already have. So of course, that is also key. And at the same time, of course, this has a positive repercussion on the reliability and resiliency of the system. Of course, faster response to extreme weather events, to potential blackouts, being able to predict where maintenance will be needed before there is an issue. And ultimately, all of this is needed like to actually have more affordable energy for end consumers. Because if we don't, let's say, think strategically and at system level, the risk is that the future energy system will cost much more than today. And of course, like we have seen during the current energy crisis, this is creating more energy poverty. And the risk with transition, if we don't address these issues, is that transition will be for the wealthier. So like, of course, like one of the key roles also of policies is to ensure that these changes actually benefit everyone, and in particular, those people that are more at risk, more vulnerable in this stage. And of course, like, yeah, I guess we'll discuss about it later, but there is also like a term also in terms of social justice, in terms of intergenerational justice, like what is the legacy that we leave like to future generations. And of course, the decision that the policymakers take today will impact like all the future generations. So of course, it is key also this like in this like to actually be aware of all these different topics, to be active and to participate, like activism, active participation, to make sure that the right decisions are taken into account, and to make sure that the voice like of people is heard. So I will just pause it here, and happy like to discuss further on this topic. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I mean, I'm kind of similar to the question I posed to Golnoosh, not in terms of market, but just in general public, why don't we all know about this? Why aren't we all thinking about this? And I know the IEA has put out report after report, roadmaps for how we achieve this for governments, for the public. And similarly, where do you think the challenges really lie? Where's the disconnect in understanding what we're truly facing here?
So I think one of the challenges is the complexity of all of this. And as Andreas was mentioning, like we're investing more and more in, in the status quo, basically. So the status quo, it's easier to understand and less riskier in a way. So I think like, especially moving forward, what we're seeing is that like right now, for example, within governments, there are silos. So renewable people like focus on renewables, energy efficiency, people on efficiency. And moving forward, what is really key is to make everybody aware that this is a systemic thing, that everything has to be rethought and changed from the start. And this is huge, like this is scary. So like, of course, like we need to go step by step, but still keeping in mind that we are facing a climate emergency, so we don't have time to waste. So like the challenge is that sometimes it's very difficult to understand where to start and to understand what the implication of certain policies are, because we're moving also like from different sectors within energy to social issues, to a more economic one, to the consequences in terms of environment. So like this is a very big, let's say, a very big situation to actually manage and to start tackle. But of course, like you need to start somewhere. There are countries around the world who are doing good on maybe separate sector. So I feel that also like international cooperation and these exchanges are really key to give the confidence to policymakers that certain things are feasible and they are necessary and urgent.
Excellent, thank you. So coming to our last speaker to her introductions, kind of bringing a lot of this together, Tom Burke, you're the founder, the chairman of the climate change think tank E3G, where you're researching climate from a variety of directions. You're looking at energy policy and efficiency, the green economy, diplomacy, all these big topics we've been talking about. And as you state, your goal is to translate climate politics economics and policies into action. But you've also spoken quite a bit about the influence of politics on making any real change, getting in the way of that action. As you've said, in our planning call, the tech is available. We're hearing about the tech. The policies are out there. The main barrier is politics. And I should note, Tom has graciously appeared in some News Decoder webinars before with some of our students around the world. He's often quoted in some of our articles that we feature on our site. And if I can just quote a recent article that you appeared in, you said, there's no real political discussion about climate change. So what you have, even in democracies, is governments offering voters, where there are voters, suites of policy prescriptions for dealing with the problem, which they hope will be attractive or acceptable. That's not a political discussion. So Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you to expand upon that and kind of, take all these topics we've started to explore and bring that political lens to it. We're on mute. Still muted. There we
are. It's finding the right button to press. Anyway, we're in a digital economy, as we were being told. We were hearing a lot about the complexity of, in a sense, the task of making the energy transition. But that to some extent conceals the fact that what we have to do is really unusual politically, because it's very clear. It's really clear, especially after the publication of the sixth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's very clear what climate policy success, and therefore a successful energy policy, will look like. It will be, the goal is to keep the rise in global temperatures below 2 degrees centigrade. We very rarely set out on a political objective as clear as that. And we also know exactly what will be required to have climate policy success. We're beginning to already experience what climate policy failure would look like and feel like for people. And climate policy success, in a sense, is very simple. We have to stop burning fossil fuels by the middle of the century. But we have to stop burning fossil fuels in a way that is both affordable and secure for all 8 billion of us on the planet to acquire the energy services that we need for a decent life. So we can't just stop burning fossil fuels. And it's as we try to do that, that the complexity starts to kick in for that. But a lot of people worry somehow that achieving that would be really bad for the economy, and somehow that's what is the biggest barrier. Well, not at a global scale. About 70% of the energy services that we obtain from burning fossil fuels ends up as waste heat. So we're spending money to achieve nothing other than heating up the atmosphere. And to get to net zero, to stop burning fossil fuels, we will enormously take that waste out of the economy. We'll increase productivity, and we'll actually have economies that function better. So it's not just that the technology to achieve that goal is already there, but we won't damage our economy as a whole in order to do that. We'll actually improve the overall efficiency of the economy. So the question that you're asking, so why aren't we doing it? If it's so obviously beneficial to us to do it, and we know what we've got to do in order to do it, where are the obstacles coming from? And as you picked up, I think most of those obstacles come from politics, not from economics or from technology. And the reason they come from politics really has two parts to it. One part of it, the more obvious part of it, is the incumbent providers of our energy are very reluctant to be, as it were, displaced by innovators. And the incumbents tend to be much closer to political power, much closer to governments, and therefore they have much influence on the choices, more influence on the choices government make than the innovators have. And that makes for a real imbalance in the power between the people who want to hold on to what they've got in terms of the markets they supply to, and the people who are actually providing something that would not only be better for the climate, but would also be better economically. And I thought it was very important what Emi was saying. The key to that future is a future that will be much more electricity dependent than the current future will, in effect, be replacing molecules, carbon molecules, by electrons. And that's requires a very different kind of design of your energy system, particularly your electricity system, and one that can now take advantage of the massive opportunities created by digitization. So that in effect, we're looking at a future where if we get this right, we'll be supplying energy to people, not so much by selling them more and more of a commodity, but by actually providing a service for them. And our business models will much more be like digitization, or like a Netflix, than they will be like our current model, which is just a classic, rather 19th, 20th century commodity supplier. And I think that's a really hopeful and optimistic view of what's possible. The incumbents will get in the way of that. The innovators will fight hard for that. But there's a second, I think, and very important political obstacle, and that's ideology. There is no way that the transition we have to make, and that in the time we have to make it, and this is a very unusual problem, in that we not only have to get to the right place, but we have to get to the right place by a specific time, or we will have failed. Then an ideology that says you want a smaller state, you want less government, you want lighter taxes, lighter regulation, is not going to help you do it. We're not going to achieve the energy transition without a fantastic mobilization of private capital. But if we're going to do that, then the state really does have to play a bigger role in determining our energy future and setting the context in which that private capital can do the work that it's really able to. Now, there are a lot of people who, for ideological reasons, want to lower the role of the state, and you see that expressing itself in those political parties that are skeptical about climate change, that resist doing the things that are necessary to do in order to achieve climate policy success. So those are the two reasons, I think, why we're not doing all the things we could be doing to take advantage of a better economy and a better environment. And one of the things that's really important about that, and particularly for young people, and I was very struck by what Golnoosh was saying about young people and their role. What's really important, most important of all, wherever it's possible for young people, they should vote. I don't mind who you vote for, but you've got to get involved. Otherwise, boomers like me are not going to leave your planet you're going to want to live in. And I am living now in Britain. I'm living with a really bad result of young people thinking that voting isn't worth doing. The overwhelming majority of young people wanted to remain in the EU, knew it would be better for their lives if they remained in the EU. And what happened in the referendum was they disproportionately did not turn out, whereas older people did turn out and took us out of the EU and actually made it harder for us both to achieve our climate goals as well as to make our economy prosperous for the future. So really important. All the other things are also important, but if you don't vote to some extent, you're just pouring your other efforts a little bit into the sand.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for that. I want to circle back to Andreas there, since it's been a while since we heard from him. If there's any response to the comments we've had thus far from our other speakers, but particularly with Tom's comments too. We're talking about governments, and specifically a question for you, Andreas, is I saw you recently had a blog post with Idri where you were looking at the challenges of coordinating and streamlining the various climate governance processes. And you have so many, and kind of related to it, Emi was speaking about how, with your work and your experience at EDRI, but maybe more broadly too, how do we get all of these policies and these efforts to talk to each other? What is the, as you said, you know, the value add of all of them, and how do we combat the ideology that might be inherent with some of them?
That's a really long and complex question, but a really good one. Yeah, maybe I could just go back a bit to explain what we do at EDRI. So we're a think tank, so we're publishing analysis, as the article you mentioned. We're a non-profit. Everything we do is freely accessible and readable for everyone. And we're also doing a lot of policy dialogues and trying to facilitate debates between various experts, policymakers, industry, civil society, academics, etc. And yeah, and looking at all of these complex issues of building new strategic roadmaps, new policies on climate and energy, and also on other sectors. But let's focus on energy and climate, since it's already quite complex. In the blog article you mentioned, we try to make a general observation on the fact that in France currently we have basically climate and energy policies are boiling. So we have a huge amount of processes going on to elaborate different decarbonization roadmaps, be it on a national scale, so we're currently in the revision of the French national low carbon strategy. We also have sectoral decarbonization roadmaps going on, being elaborated for buildings, mobility, agriculture, industry, etc., etc. We have a new green industry law coming up. So a lot of things are happening, and that's basically great news, because it shows that a lot of people want to get involved at all levels and all sides of society. But at some point, we're coming to a point where it might be too much, and we're not seeing clearly where's the coherency, where's the added value of each new process. Because in the end, the high risk, especially facing all the crises and urgencies that all of us mentioned, is that we can spend a lot of time making new plans, making new strategies, showing us how we could achieve targets by 2050, but not acting in the end. So it's like, debating about the debate. And I think Tom made a really good and very important point. It's about politics in the end. So what we're trying to achieve is it's peculiar, it's very specific in history, because we actually, all of the transitions that have happened before, we didn't really know that they were happening. We didn't see them as transitions happening, and especially we didn't know the exit point. We didn't know where we wanted to get to. Today we know exactly where we want to get to, but making it happen is very difficult, because we have different interests in society, which is all natural and legitimate. But we have to create the debate, and we actually have to create decisions to go forward. And that's what we see, at least in French climate governance. We're doing a lot of strategic roadmaps targeting 2030, 2050. But as I mentioned earlier, we're not doing enough right now. And we actually, being in the field for a few years now, in some sectors, especially in buildings and building renovations, we're talking about the exact same issues today that we've been talking about 10 years ago. And we can keep talking for 10 other years, but it's really important to just trigger something. So it's about political courage to just try something new, go forward, to also, as Tom mentioned, go beyond the power of the incumbents and just say, okay, you had your part of the cake during a few decades. Now we possibly have to go to something different because of a variety of issues. So yeah, I think that's really the important point to not, in climate policies, of course, it's important to have strategic roadmaps targeting 2050, targeting climate neutrality. But in the end, it really comes down to what we are being able to do in the next years. And something that really comes out of current assessments for the low carbon transition, be it in Europe or worldwide, is that the period up to 2030 will really be a trigger point. So what we're able to do or not to do in the coming 7 years to really accelerate the transition in every sector will be very much paving the way to where we end up in 2050. So that's really, I think, the basic idea we have to get to. And this means we have to pour out huge amounts of investments and really, in French, we have this expression of la politique des petits pas. So doing politics by small steps. And right now, it's not about incremental change. We really have to go deeper. We have to create the conditions of structural transformation. And this hurts in some ways because it means that we really change economic structures. We create a lot of fear for change. We threaten a lot of interests, economic interests, and we can see it currently in Europe. If you look at what happened in the last few days or weeks, actually, on the ban for internal combustion engines by 2035, which was basically already adopted by all of the member states, and then the automobile industry in Germany and Italy came back, went back to the governments, and did a great lobbying effort so that Germany tried to step out of this agreement and creating a new loophole. So of course it's difficult, but we really have to put out the signals that things are going to change and that we are getting there.
Excellent, thank you. Taking our time, maybe one more question, then we'll come to our audience to have a chance to ask some questions of our panelists here. One thing you just said, Andreas, we're not doing enough. This is kind of a question that's come up time and again, is the role of behavior between individuals and institutions, and where does the responsibility lie? Where does the action lie? We've talked about renewables, electric cars, changing our energy consumption, but also these systemic infrastructure changes, the large scale industrial innovations. And so just a question to pose for all of you, what do you see as the balance? What is the role of behavior? Especially I think for a younger generation, there is this burden of responsibility in a lot of ways and causes a lot of eco-anxiety and distress. This is the message you're being fed, but balanced with the politics that come behind it too. And, these massive conferences that take place, and does anything really happen? What do you see as the role of the balance of behavior? So may I come to Golnoosh first?
Well, answering to this question is not very straightforward. I would say to overcome the gap, what we would need to raise the awareness and to make everyone learn about what can be done on their part if they are individuals, if each of us, we are trying to change the way we behave, change the way we are consuming energy, change just simple habits can make a big change as a system. And so that's the first message would be to let's start from ourselves. The second one would be to let's start to act. I mean, there is also a gap between, going back to what I was saying, the gap of research versus the technology that it is actually implemented. So to overcome the gap, we would need to boost the ways to finance this research and to actually make them to come into the market and to be like a product ready to use for industry, for individuals. Maybe I'm mainly focused on the industry because that's where I am comfortable I am working in that sector, so I would just take the examples from the industry. But it comes also for the electric vehicles, for the energy efficiency in the building, for renewables, in a general scope. I would say we would need to overcome the gap between what is in the academia world and to actually have the social acceptance, to have the government supporting this, to have investors, to have entrepreneurs to come up with their ideas and to take all these ready to go to market ideas into the market and to make them to actually help us tackle these problems that we are always listing and we are not acting to solve them. So that would be my 2 messages.
Good messages, excellent. And Emi, coming to you, same question.
Yeah, so from my end, what I would say is that if there is a positive in this crisis is that more and more people are aware of the issue, are aware that energy is central for everything, and then that, let's say, an increase in price is really affecting everything from food prices to transport to many other things. So I feel there is a need to understand a bit better, let's say, since this crisis and the war actually managed to mobilize quite a lot of people, how can we keep that interest alive? How can we transform, let's say, a temporary behavior in something that is more long-lasting, and that may be, let's say, not just switching or reducing or increasing the temperature of cooling and heating, but also maybe investing in and paying more attention in what is more efficient in terms of devices, and what are, let's say, alternatives that would allow us to use less and use better. And this applies actually to many parts of our life, from clothes to the way, like we eat, we do different things. And at the same time, connecting to the innovation point of view, of course, like there is a lot that has to be done in terms of research and innovation, but I think like one of the huge lacking points is communication of results, of benefits, of numbers. It would actually make investors and also policymakers more confident that a certain technology can bring benefits. So like that's part of the work that we're trying to do as well. And actually, I see a lot of movement internationally, also in connected different initiatives in different geographies to share those learnings and avoid to start all over again with new pilot projects, with new demonstration to see if the technology really works. Because I think like we've done a lot, it's just a matter of leveraging those opportunities as best.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. I'll come back to you. You already had one bit of advice to vote, but if you want to add anything to that.
Well, just this, I don't think there is a problem with public awareness. I think that people's experience of what's happening in their daily lives to the weather events has really validated the science of climate change in the public mind. And though it never makes the newspapers, doesn't make TV, and people aren't making TikTok or Instagram pictures of it, there are an enormous number of things that people are doing in their own lives already, wherever they can, both as individuals and in groups, to actually do something about it, whatever they can. And where there's a real failure is in the role of government to create more space to support all the things that people are already willing to do. And it's very easy for politicians to blame the people for things that are not happening in order for them to evade their responsibility to give a lead, which is actually why we put politicians in those jobs in the first place, is so they can give a lead. In a sense, the people are way ahead of what they're expecting governments to do about climate change and therefore the energy transition than politicians pretty well everywhere in the democracies are really willing to do.
And Andreas, will come to you. Anything to add on this, the role of individuals versus governments, institutions?
Well, I think they're all needed, they're all complementary, no? So of course we all have responsibilities on our own. We can do a lot by just deciding on how we consume, on how we travel, and all of that. But there was a study done by a French think tank, I think last year, which showed basically that individual decisions could reduce emissions by 25%. Meaning that it's actually, it is important, because going to carbon neutrality really requires to do everything. We don't have any choice anymore to say we're doing this, but not that, we have to do it all. But in the end, to facilitate individual changes, we need infrastructure change, we need political decisions, we need pricing decisions. I mean, just to give one very basic example, you cannot keep on telling people that it's better to travel by train than by plane, and then come out with tariffs where the exact same travel by train costs you 250 euros and 30 euros by a plane. You cannot possibly tell this to people when jet fuel is basically not taxed, and that electricity and any other fuel is taxed. You cannot tell people that it's very important to consume less energy this winter because we have a crisis, and then completely take off the pricing signal by saying, okay, we're blocking tariffs. It's just, and it's what we could call the complete dissonance, you know, the contradictions, inherent contradictions of policy, which makes it so difficult for individuals to actually navigate through all of that. Because even if you have your core values and say, I want to do good, I want to do the right thing, actually all of the signals are not making it easy for you. Or sometimes you can also encounter kind of conflicts between various objectives, you know, because it's not all about the climate. You also have a lot of other stuff to deal with. So yeah, I think it all comes together. But it would be much too easy for politics to just rely on saying, okay, it's about the individuals, as long as consumption behavior is not changing, we cannot do this. And there's so many examples where it's exactly the other way around. You know, if you go for bicycles in main cities, you always see the same, that it's the infrastructure which creates the demand. The day when Paris started to actually do something about biking lanes and putting like out a plan on we're gonna do like biking highways, the number of cyclists increased tenfold. That's what happens. So I think it's really important to get it all together, and going back to Tom's point, the main link between the individual decisions and politics is voting in the end.
Excellent. That's a great wrap up, and really speaks to the intersectionality of all of these issues. There's not just energy, there's not just environmental justice, there's not just economics, they're all intertwined. Okay, well, we have done a lot of talking. We'd love to turn it over to our audience for any questions you might have of our panelists.
Thank you so much. Before we do that, can we have a big round of applause, please, for everyone who spoke tonight? Thank you. Thank you so much, Maria, for all your planning. What's so fantastic about these events, and we didn't highlight it at the beginning, is they are 90 minutes long, so we have an extra half an hour to engage all of you. And again, whether you're in person or on Zoom, you're very welcome to pose questions. There was a hand here.
Thank you so much for speaking to the four of you. It was very interesting. I'm curious about, I guess, on the consumer level, things that you're talking about, you know, buying an EV or installing solar panels. I mean, these are just examples, maybe aren't as accessible to some people. I'm wondering if there are any success stories from countries where, you know, we've heard of, you know, stipends from the government encouraging people to buy electric vehicles, et cetera. Do those work? What's the effect of those things on the average consumer?
I don't know if I can have a quick reaction to this. I feel there have been quite a lot of incentives around the world. The problem for me is that some of them are not linked to a certain income, for example. So the risk is that many of these would actually benefit people who already are wealthy enough to be able to implement those changes. So of course, what is important is to attach an affordability element to it, and to maybe target a bit more these kind of policies to this area of the society that really need that support, and maybe find other ways to motivate others. And also, I mean, as I was mentioning, the complexity, we see in some countries where they actually push for a lot of rooftop PV. So there was like a huge increase, even in some emerging economies. But then like this was not linked to actually a strengthening of the grid and use of digitalization to actually map where all these resources were. So let's say it seemed like probably was a success then, like if they have this boom, because of course you have like positive, for example, not only incentives to buy these rooftop PVs, but also tariffs that incentivate you to sell back to the grid, for example, where you can actually recover that investment quite quickly. So I would say maybe this is not, let's say, these are successful, but maybe there should be ways in which these should be more targeted where it's needed and where this money can really like make a huge change. And maybe like just to mention very quickly, like there's a work that some of my colleagues have done in really like analyzing different percentiles of the population and how much like they impact the emissions. And of course, the wealthiest, the top part, like has, I don't know, 1,000 times more of emission than those that are, let's say, the poorest in a way. So like perhaps there could be like a way to target also those we're like hearing about jet fuel, for example. So like probably it's not a matter of asking yourself whether this works or not, but how to make it work better and target it like to advance faster.
Great, Andreas, we see your hand is raised. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just to give some other examples on I think we have a lot of best practice cases around Europe and around the world, which are kind of interesting, but just to give a few, of course, you have Norway, where right now 80% of new vehicles sold are electric vehicles, which is huge. I mean, it's impressive compared to what's happening in Germany and France and other countries. So this is kind of interesting, and it happened thanks to subsidies and great infrastructure rollout. You have the Netherlands, which is kind of a very interesting case because nobody's talking about the Netherlands. Everybody's talking about Germany, UK, France, or whatever. The Netherlands were actually the European country which had the lowest share of renewable energy back in the 2000s. And they were hugely dependent on natural gas because having their own natural gas resources, basically. And then a few things happened with, well, they got aware of the fact that they will deplete their own resources. They had earthquakes happening related to natural gas mines. And they decided on doing a transition, and being a very pragmatic country, they decided to do it quickly. And in a bunch of years, basically, they raised the share of renewable energies in the electricity mix from something like 6% to right now, I think 40%. And most of this stuff has happened, interestingly enough, through local cooperatives. So starting from nowhere, where they basically had no local energy cooperatives, they have more than 1,000 operating right now. They have at least one local citizen cooperative for renewable energies operating in each of the municipalities. So this is kind of interesting because it's a country which is very densely populated, which is small in scale. So it's actually kind of difficult to find the surfaces to do wind energy projects or other projects. And they had their fair share of local oppositions, but they became aware of the fact that the only way to deploy new renewable projects was by sharing actually the benefits and sharing the decision making with the local actors, with the communities, with the municipalities and the citizens. So that's kind of a very interesting example. We have a bit of the same story in Germany and Denmark as well historically, but I think the Netherlands is really worth taking a look on how the transition can happen very quickly.
Thank you, Tom. Another virtual raised hand.
Yeah, just to actually follow Andreas and remind you of one of the things he said that helps to confuse people. We spend $1 trillion a year, I think I remembered that right, on fossil fuel subsidies. Well, if you're spending $1 trillion a year in making the problem worse, how on earth do you expect people to come around and say, we'll do our bit to make the problem better? So the first thing governments need to do is to stop doing things that confuse people and to come up with a consistent message. Now, that's true as much for individuals as it is for companies and investors, that if there's no consistent message coming out of governments, then people wonder and get confused, understandably, and therefore don't feel they should make the extra effort. But more broadly, there's a real tendency amongst politicians to try to get government to do a bit of everything in order to please a little bit everybody. And the reality is that ends up meaning you don't do enough of anything to actually make a difference, and you add to the confusion. So governments have really got to focus down on the things that will deliver the most, as it were, carbon savings and economic efficiencies for the dollar or euro you spend. Pick on 4 or 5 of those and then focus on the issue of deploying those. Once people see that momentum is building up, they look for ways to contribute. If they see, as what they're seeing right now, seeing in today's plan from the UK, we're trying to do some of everything, but we're not quite sure when we're going to do anything, then people don't feel they want to contribute. So there's quite a lot to be done by the politicians to harness, I think, the willingness of people to play their part, if only they can see how.
Thank you. Yes.
Question to anyone really on the panel, but a crisis often is the engine for radical change. And, you know, the energy crisis we have now, a lot of people say it's the biggest crisis we've seen, you know, in a generation or two. Do you think that this is the engine for a new wave of political leadership, perhaps, to arise? Do you see any of that coming, or are there other examples, maybe from, you know, not in the energy sector in the past, where you see this sort of radical change having happened with the result of a crisis? And are there sort of lessons for the budding leaders of today and tomorrow to shift the status quo that you might offer some insights for us on?
Andreas, please.
I was looking to raise the hand, but I was too slow. Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, and it goes back to a point I made earlier, that we always assume that a crisis will lead to radical change and just make things obvious on we really need to do this transition. And as I explained earlier, the basic political reaction we all have is facing pressure, facing crisis, is not to change. Is really trying to remain as conservative as possible, and it's something quite natural. And that's what I try to explain with the basic political reaction to the energy crisis, which was more about really economic and social relief, even though most of the decisions went against the transition. But a few powerful things can happen. And it's not only about the crisis itself, but it has induced a kind of change of scale in what we're doing. And it's interestingly enough, it's not so much the gas crisis itself, because some people are already saying, telling you, well, the crisis is over, wholesale market prices in Europe are back to around 40, 50 euros per megawatt hour for natural gas. So nobody talks about the crisis now, which might be very wrong. But in the same time, we have interesting stuff happening in China and the US, which are not so much concerned by the current gas crisis, but just decided to say, okay, we're taking the whole thing from a much more industrial policy side. And we're just deciding to take the leadership for tomorrow. And bringing this huge market potential on renewables, on energy efficiency, on electric vehicles to us. And I think that created an interesting kind of stimulus and circle pressure, where Europe as well said, okay, we need our own green industry law, a green industry plan. And kind of right now, we have billions and billions of public money going into new investments to build battery plants or you know, any kind of renewables, etc. And it's kind of interesting, because sometimes you get the impression that this economic race, economic competition will stir much more progress than any climate catastrophe or any even geopolitical crisis can create before that.
Thank you. Any in-person responses? I just want to make sure we're acknowledging.
I don't have much to add on the, let's say, the transformative aspect of crisis, but on this fact that this is actually becoming an industrial kind of message of revolution. Like I have to agree with that. And actually, like all these changes, like not only the economic side of things, but also the security. And I think like that is the main driver of all of this happening, because what this crisis made countries realize is that they were dependent on very few for their supply, for their material, for the supply chain, as we could see, for example, even with COVID and all the disruptions in material and in supplies. So I think, yes, there is a run in like starting to position like countries like at best, like in terms of, yeah, these resources, industrial facilities, etc. So just wanted to bring like back this idea of this is all a matter of security, probably. So luckily it is like focused on the transition. So hopefully we'll see like stuff moving forward faster. But I think ultimately that was, and that is the main concern of a lot of countries.
Thank you. Tom, you have your hand raised.
Thank you. I think the questioner was right to bring up the point about shocks. If you said in January last year that Germany could get through the whole of the winter of 22-23 without using Russian gas, people would have thought you were mad. But that's happened, not just Germany, but actually the whole of the EU has managed to do that. And that tells you what we're actually capable of in response to a shock. The problem with climate change is by the time the shock is that visible as Putin invading the Ukraine, it will be too late to do something about the problem. And that means you really do have to place more emphasis, as it's just been said, on the importance of leadership, political leadership, to do what a shock could do, but in this case won't be able to do in a way that actually helps to solve the problem.
Thank you. Yes, we have another in-person question. I just want to encourage the Zoom audience to also post in the chat, because we can read out your questions. So do go ahead and post.
Hi, I'm wondering if any of you could maybe talk about another role model country or a country that's kind of setting the standard for good practices and where we've seen a lot of success for the energy transition.
Yeah, maybe from my end, like in terms of digitalization, what let's say the country we often look at is the UK, for example. So like they really like make this digitalization strategy that is encompassing like a number of different sectors. And of course, like it goes from governance, it goes from, okay, what technologies you need and where, what models you need. And there is an interesting, let's say, model also like supported by a group of experts around the energy system catapult that are creating that evidence, the study that is actually supporting or helping also policymakers in moving forward in terms of regulation and policy. So I think that is one. And then maybe another one in terms of what the future might look on some of these topics is Australia. Yeah, out of necessity as well. I think they push forward quite fast also in terms of renewables adoption, in terms of more flexibility, let's say, in the system. And I think they have gone already like through a number of steps where they might have made some mistake to adjust, or they did some trial. So I think they have quite a lot of learning that could be of help for other countries. But of course, the issue is also that every country is a bit different. So you can't really replicate what was done in some of these, like in other countries. But there could be some useful learnings from these, for example.
Andreas, yes, please.
Yeah, just another very well-known best practice country would be Sweden. Sweden, which was basically one of the first countries in the world to put in place a carbon tax as early as 1990, when most of the countries weren't even talking about climate policy. And they put up a carbon tax with a very clear price trajectory, just going up and up and up. And they did this in a way which should be done in most countries and hasn't always been done, which means not just adding up a carbon tax, but doing it in a greater fiscal reform, where they basically lower taxes on labor and raise taxes on fossil energies. And this paves the way for a lot of transformative change happening afterwards, mainly the decarbonization of the heating networks. Because one of the other interesting examples or experiences in Sweden is that it's one of the countries which very early in the 1960s focused on really establishing district heating as the main heating option in every city or in every urban area. So that in urban areas in Sweden, about 90% of all households are connected to district heating, which actually makes it very easy to decarbonize the heating system afterwards, because you don't have to go into each one of the households, each one of the homes, and change a boiler and change a heating system, doing an energy renovation, etc. You just have to focus on how you decarbonize the supply for the plant, which is creating the heat for the whole district heating network. And this way, Sweden has managed to basically have low carbon heat already. And they're targeting to have full low carbon heat by 2030. They already have full low carbon electricity with a mix based on hydropower and nuclear, and now solar and wind also coming in. And they also pretty much advanced on rolling out electric vehicles. So that's another very interesting case to look at.
Can I ask a related question to what's an example of a country that one should absolutely not follow? Because I think we can learn as much from failure, right, as success. So perhaps somebody would like to intervene on that question.
Yeah, I'm happy to join that one. France. It simply is the worst possible thing you could do is try to decarbonize your energy system by building nuclear power stations. They're too expensive. They take too long to build. They stop you doing other things because of the amount of capital they consume that will deliver faster and cheaper carbon-free electricity to consumers. I mean, France wants to do that. It's a problem for France. I just think nobody else should follow that example.
I just have one. I think before this talk, I was speaking to some friends about the energy transition, and I think for a lot of people who maybe don't work in the field, it's kind of a nebulous topic. And I was just wondering if you could synthesize it. What is the energy transition into maybe something accessible for high school students? I've worked a lot with them in the past, and I'm wondering how to translate this discussion into things that will make sense for people outside of this room.
I think that's a good question for everyone. So maybe we can just go around and, well, Andreas has his hand up, so we'll start there first.
I think it's an excellent question, and the best way I'd find, in a very general terms, would be to go from stock-based energies to flow-based energies, meaning that we have to transition from energies which have built up reserves in the soils over millions of years. So we have a stock basically of resource depleting, of course, to flow energies which are basically infinite if we just consider the energy source itself, be it hydro, wind, or solar. And the same reasoning could apply in the transition to the financial aspect. We want to transition from an economic system which is built on operational costs being my energy bill, being maintenance work, etc., to an economy based on capex, based on capital investments. which are my investments into energy efficiency, into wind turbines, solar power plants, electric vehicles, everything that runs in a much more efficient way. And once I have done my initial investment, I don't have to care so much about the operational costs, which also means that we're, of course, going into a much more resilient economy, because much less dependent on volatile energy price shocks. So really, this idea of going from stock-based to flow-based, from OPEX, from operational costs to capital costs, and then of course going to much more efficient consumption patterns. So being more sufficient, which is about really requiring less energy for less service basically, and being much more efficient, requiring less energy input for the same service.
Maybe we'll come to Tom next to share.
Yeah, well, just to follow really, because I agree with what Andreas has just said very much. Let me, to give you options, put it in a slightly different way. Nobody wants to buy an energy commodity. People want to buy the services that the use of those commodities provides. So if you can cut out, as it were, the need for a commodity, what Andreas talks about, in a sense, going to a flow, then you've got something that's actually delivering directly to people what they want. That means you create a market to supply a service rather than a market to provide a commodity. That's a big change in mindset, but it's not necessarily a big change in what actually happens. It does, however, make a very interesting point about what's the big factor that drives that. And Andreas is right. The price of capital then becomes a lot more important in getting policies to move in the right direction, price of money, in other words, than the price of carbon. And so you don't have to punish people by putting the price of carbon up to get them to do the right thing, if what you're actually doing is lowering the price of capital for people who want to invest exactly in moving from a stock to a flow economy.
Thank you. And Golnoosh, our engineer, how do you synthesize this conversation for a high school student or a general interested public?
So I would say, with the final goal of reducing the carbon emissions, we should find energy resources that are carbon neutral, which means we should develop them the way that they are harming the climate as minimum as possible. And by that, we would need to depend the minimum on the fossil fuels. For sure, we can always use transition fuels such as natural gas, but the final goal is to reach to the trustable and actually feasible ways to use these energy resources. And something that was not noted today was the energy storage, which is overseen. And in order to have an energy system which is trusted and is actually working, if we are not using fossil fuels, we would need to have the right means to store energy. So for the moment, we can say batteries are trustable. We can say hydrogen can be mature and trustable. And to add over the top of them, it's carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which is now developing, and it's going to be helping a lot with the reduction of all these emissions from different energy resources. So I would see this as a system that all of these players would help to have transition towards a, let's say, greener energy system.
Thank you. And we'll come to Emi, the final word on this.
Yeah, maybe to add just briefly on this, because a lot has been said, of course, like greener production of electricity, but overall, I would stress the importance of system efficiency. So using better, using less, and of course, using greener in a way.
Oh, okay, one more question. Final question. Mike, yes.
Well, thank you. First of all, fantastic discussion. I really appreciate all the comments. I do agree that I think politics is probably the best way to try to enact the changes that we need in the time that we need to do it. But I'm pessimistic about it until you talked about the examples of the Netherlands and Sweden. So my question is, What is it about their systems, you think, that enable their citizens to influence their government to make the changes that they need? Is it because the governments incentivize a pro-climate measures so the everyday citizens bought into it? Is it because they're more educated about the effects of climate change and more concerned? And the reason why I'm asking is because obviously the United States is not in that situation right now, and yet we generate the most amount of carbon. So what lessons can we learn politically from those two countries that maybe we can apply to the US? Thanks.
I should probably take this, having talked about Sweden, or at least I can try to add some insights. I tend to say that the Scandinavian countries are, in terms of politics, mostly more built on coalition governments. So they have a very pragmatic culture of coalitions, not so how to say, but enshrined in ideology and too much value debate. So anything that seems rational, they'll just go on and do it. We also have two countries which have a very high economy and wealth per capita, which makes it easier, and which are also both of them very highly endowed with natural resources. Mostly hydropower, but also huge surfaces, huge forests. So biomass is another big issue here. And for Norway also oil, and which gave them a big capital reserve to make this transition happening. So it's also, I think it's both political, because we also have cases of other countries which have the same wealth but didn't do anything, or did not do as much possibly in the Middle East or even Australia or the US. But yeah, I think it's this mixture of having a political system which is much more based on compromise and on coalitions, and really on rational decision making rather than ideological debate. Because in France, it's pretty much as in the US, I think we can debate for years and years and years and nothing will ever happen.
Democracy is what matters, basically, because despots destroy all of the machinery human beings have ever invented to learn from their mistakes. And there's no mistake-free way to a safe climate. And I think Andreas is being a little bit modest in saying that the two countries you identified, Sweden and the Netherlands, are both countries that actually most Europeans would think have got their democracy more deeply embedded. And I think for the world, it's a real problem if the United States of America does not restore all of our faith in the depth of its democracy.